Hi everybody. In this video, I would like to go over some of the main points of John Hick's soul making and suffering. Hick starts with a two-stage conception of the creation of humans. In stage one, God causes the physical universe to exist, and in stage two, a creature is made out of the evolution of forms of organic life, who has the possibility of existing in conscious fellowship with God. The problem with the second stage is that God cannot perform the stage by himself. Here's the first stage, and the second stage is somewhere. Second stage, okay? The problem with the second stage, again, is that God cannot perform the stage by himself because humans are essentially free and self-directing. Before stating his thesis, he presents an important assumption, right down here, that human goodness comes about through mastering temptations and making responsible choices through an investment of costly personal effort. His thesis is to argue, he says suggest, that, and I'm paraphrasing here, it is reasonable to believe that human goodness is slowly built up through a long, difficult soul-making process. And further, that the world needs to be the way it is with all the evil that's in it in order for that to happen. Now, Hick says that the progressive fulfillment of God's purpose does not entail any corresponding progressive improvement in the moral state of the world, so that humans have to do that themselves. He says that anti-theistic writers assume that the purpose of a loving God must be to create a hedonistic paradise that puts pleasure above all else. He argues throughout this paper that God's purpose is not to create a pleasure paradise for humans, but rather to have a place where humans can best come up against the friction of life and develop their souls. On page 70, he says that such critics as Hume are confusing what He says such critics as Hume confuse what heaven ought to be with what this world should be. Okay. The world is not intended to be a paradise, but rather the scene of a history in which human personality may be formed in the pattern of Christ. He gives an example of good parents to make his point. He says, I think it is clear that a parent who loves his child and wants them to become the best human beings that they are capable of becoming does not treat pleasure as the sole and supreme value. He says, to most parents, it seems more important to try to foster quality and strength of character in their children than to fill their lives at all times with the utmost possible degree of pleasure. So the primary purpose of the world is soul making, not to provide safety and pleasure for everyone in all circumstances. On page 173, Hick distinguishes between pain and suffering. Pain is a specific physical sensation, while suffering is a complex mental state. On page 174, he says that suffering is a state of mind in which we wish violently or obsessively that our situation were otherwise. Suffering, he says, is a function of sin. Suffering is really optional because if we were fully conscious of God, we should be able to accept our own lives in its entirety and be free from anguish on account of it. So human suffering is self-regarding, where we wish for our own sake that our situation were different. Christ's suffering, on the other hand, is an other regarding anguish. This is right down here. He grieved on the account of others, not for himself. He did not suffer egotistically as we do. On page 178, Hick deals with a couple of objections by David Hume, which he calls suggestions. Suggestions, right down here. Hume says that God could directly intervene in the workings of nature to prevent any occasion of suffering and to produce the maximum amount of pleasure and happiness. So why does he not do that? Hick thinks that this is a flawed suggestion because in such a world, its consequences for men's status as a moral being would be bad. It would mean that no wrong action could ever have bad effects and that no piece of carelessness and moral judgment in dealing with the world could ever lead to harmful consequences. So he says that in such a world, moral qualities would no longer have any point or value. Any point or value. Another suggestion by Hume, perhaps God could intervene only secretly and on special occasions to prevent exceptional and excessive evils. Hick says that even though this suggestion is more plausible, evils are exceptional only in relation to other evils, which are routine. So unless God eliminated all evils whatsoever, there would always be relatively outstanding ones of which it would be said that he should have secretly prevented them. In other words, as soon as the worst evils and sufferings disappear, the remaining worst evils would need to be prevented. And then the next worst evils would become the worst and need to be prevented, and so on. There would always be the greatest evils that it would seem God should be preventing. What Hick calls Hume's fourth and last complaint on page 182. Let's see. Okay, right down here. Hick thinks this one presents some problems. Using Hick's words, actually, he gives the words over here. Okay, right around here. Need the world contain, I'm paraphrasing here, need the world contain the more extreme and crushing evils which it in fact contains? Need there be gigantic famines, volcanic eruptions burying whole cities, earthquakes killing thousands? Need there also be fearful diseases such as typhoid, polio, and cancer? These reach far beyond any constructive function of character training and seem to only be dysteleological and destructive. These words. Now, dysteleological here looks like a very foreign word. All you have here is a prefix, the dis, which means bad, and teleological, which means purpose. You may have encountered this word in your other philosophy classes, and certainly with the teleological arguments for the existence of God. So it means like a bad outcome or bad purpose. So these seem to be, the effects of these seem to be destructive and to a bad purpose. After going over a few possible responses to this, Hick on page 186 presents what he calls the only appeal left, mystery. By mystery, he doesn't mean merely an appeal to the negative fact that we can't discern any rationale of human suffering, but rather that it may be that the very mysteriousness of this life is an important aspect of its character as a sphere of soul making. Right in here. He asks us to imagine taking out all the unjust and undeserved or excessive human misery caused by all of the things that Hume brings up. He says, in such a world, human misery would not evoke deep personal sympathy or call forth organized relief and sacrificial help and service. In other words, the fact that horrible things happen and that we don't know why they happen causes humans to act in true compassion and massive generosity. In closing, on page 187, he says, our solution then to this baffling problem of excessive and undeserved suffering is a frank appeal to the positive value of mystery. Is this a good response to the problem? I hope this video has helped you understand this important and influential reading. Thank you for your time and attention.